Hello and welcome to today's lesson on the Prelude by William Wordsworth, or rather an extract from the Prelude. It's often informally known as stealing the boat. Okay, the first thing we're going to do in today's lesson is we're going to look at the context behind the poem and the poet himself. Okay, so William Wordsworth was born in 1770 to parents John and Anne. Sadly, they passed away when William was still young. A lot of people could theorize that perhaps there's a link between the rather somber, melancholy tone to his poems and the fact that he did experience tragedy so early on in his life. Now, a big part of William Wordsworth's life when he was growing up was nature, and he grew up in the mountains of Cumberland, um, in a region known as the Lake District, where he was greatly inspired by nature. This is an example of the kind of nature that he was surrounded by: fantastic mountains and lakes, and he'd often go for walks in nature, and he actually spoke about a communion with nature, almost as if he had a spiritual connection with nature. He was a leading member of the Romantic movement, and the Romantic movement was actually an intellectual movement that followed the French Revolution. Now, the French Revolution, as you can see here, was where the French monarchy were overthrown and a Republic of France was born. Now, this triggered a bit of an intellectual movement away from scientific ideas and industrial ideas. After all, there was a lot of factories and industrial movement going on around this time period, but people started to drift away from that and look at more emotional ideas, and there was a particular fascination with nature around this time period. This is a very famous painting from the Romantic movement, and as you can see, the focus of this picture really is being inspired and in awe with nature. Now, as a poetic movement, the key poets were, of course, William Wordsworth, but also Lord Byron, and we'll look at Lord Byron in a different poem that you'll study for your GCSE, known as The Destruction of Sennacherib. Another key poet in the movement was Samuel Taylor Coleridge. Now, Coleridge and Wordsworth were great friends, and they wrote extensively together. So, in a nutshell, the movement really was characterized by a focus on nature and natural beauty. So, you'll see that in the poem that we're going to look at today. So Stealing the Boat, as this poem's often informally known, is an extract from a much longer autobiographical poem called The Prelude. Now, The Prelude documents William Wordsworth's early life, of course, in a poetic fashion. So we know the speaker in this poem and the protagonist is actually William Wordsworth himself. Now, William Wordsworth died at the age of 80 in 1850, which, as you can imagine, back in 1850 was actually a grand old age. Okay, so what we're going to do now is we're just going to read through the poem before going back and analysing the poem line by line in some bite-sized chunks. Okay. One summer evening, led by her, I found a little boat tied to a willow tree within a rocky cove, its usual home. Straight I unloosed her chain, and stepping in, pushed from the shore. It was an act of stealth and troubled pleasure, nor without the voice of mountain echoes did my boat move on, leaving behind her still, on either side, small circles glittering idly in the moon, until they melted all into one track of sparkling light. But now, like one who rows, proud of his skill to reach a chosen point with an unswerving line, I fixed my view upon the summit of a craggy ridge, the the horizon's utmost boundary. Far above was nothing but the stars and the grey sky. She was an elfin pinnace. Lustily I dipped my oars into the silent lake, and as I rose upon the stroke, my boat went heaving through the water like a swan. When from behind that craggy steep, till then the horizon's bound, a huge peak, black and huge, as if with voluntary power instinct, upreared its head, I struck and struck again, and growing in stature, the grim shape towered up between me and the stars, and still, for so it seemed, with purpose of its own, and measured motion like a living thing, strode after me. With trembling oars I turned, and through the silent water stole my way back to the covert of the willow tree. There in her mooring place I left my bark, and through the meadows homeward went in grave and serious mood. But after I had seen that spectacle for many days, my brain worked with a dim and undetermined sense of unknown modes of being. Over my thoughts there hung a darkness. Call it solitude or blank desertion. No familiar shapes remained, no pleasant images of trees, of sea, or sky, no colours of green fields, but huge and mighty forms that do not live like living men, moved slowly through the mind by day, and were a trouble to my dreams. As this is a rather long poem, what we're going to do is break the poem down into sort of bite-sized chunks. Let's start off with the first line. So it begins, one summer evening. This immediately establishes actually quite a positive tone. And we have in brackets led by her. Who is her? Is it a mysterious woman? Now, actually, we believe, no, it's not an actual human being. Her is obviously a female pronoun, and it's often used to refer to a boat. And obviously, we know this poem is in part going to be about stealing a boat. So this female pronoun, her, perhaps just refers to the boat, that the fact that the mission of stealing the boat is leading him on. A wider analysis could perhaps be that her is in fact Mother Nature, and that somehow Mother Nature itself or herself is compelling him forward. So it goes on to say, I found a little boat tied to a willow tree. Now it says a little boat, it doesn't say his little boat. So again, linking with that title, we assume that he's taking something that isn't his. Within a rocky cove, its usual home. Actually, these couple of words, usual home, are actually fairly revealing. It suggests a familiarity with his environment, that he's been there before. Perhaps he's even done this before. He goes on, straight I unloosened her chain. Again, we carry on with this personification of the boat, her, back with the female pronoun. And stepping in, pushed from the shore. It was an act of stealth. Now, what does the word stealth mean? So, stealth is when you act with the intention of not being seen. So, think about James Bond. It's often used in a spying context. James Bond would act with stealth because when he's spying on foreign nations, he wouldn't want to be seen. And it's the same thing here. William Wordsworth, when he's stealing the boat, he does not want to be seen. He is acting with stealth. And he does this, it goes on to say, it was an act of stealth and troubled pleasure. Now, troubled pleasure is itself an oxymoron. These two words seem to contradict each other. Pleasure suggests he's getting a sort of kick at the act of stealing the boat, whereas troubled suggests there's almost some foreboding in his mind. He realizes perhaps he shouldn't be doing what he's doing, and that it may result in his comeuppance somehow. Now we carry on. Nor without the voice of mountain echoes did my boat move on. It's got this personification of nature again, mountain echoes, reinforcing this idea of nature being immense, almost overwhelming. So we carry on, leaving behind her still on either side small circles glittering idly in the moon. Now this use of pathetic fallacy establishes quite a quiet, calm, relaxing, tranquil atmosphere. At the moment, this is a fairly gentle adventure. He's going out, stealing the boat, presumably. He's going to sail around the lake, admire nature, and go back to his normal life, we think so far. Until they melted all into one track of sparkling light. So again, it's very positive, very gentle imagery at this point. But now, like one who rows, proud of his skill to reach a chosen point with an unswerving line. These couple of lines are actually quite revealing. He talks about proud of his skill, unswerving line. It's very notable that the protagonist is very confident at this point. He's very confident in himself and his ability to enjoy nature, to enjoy what he's doing. This is going to become very important later on in the poem when perhaps he loses this confidence. So it talks about, I fixed my view upon the summit of a craggy ridge. Now the summit is the uppermost peak of a mountain. So he has this ambitious aim in mind of aiming towards the summit. He sees the horizon's utmost boundary. And again, this really establishes how grand, how epic, how overwhelming nature is, that he can almost see the boundary of nature and the horizon. We go on, far above was nothing but the stars and the grey sky. So linking back to what I've said before about glittering idly in the moon, sparkling light, at the moment, pathetic fallacy and setting is being used to reinforce a very positive view of nature, a very tranquil view of nature. But again, as we move on from this poem, this will change. So carrying on with this personification, William Wordsworth is clearly referring to the boat itself, and he says she was an elfin pinnace. Now this simply means elfin, meaning small. Pinnace is a type of light, small boat. So he's saying this vessel that he's sailing on is very small. And this is important because think about how big this lake is, think about how big the mountains are. He is in almost a vulnerable position, and that's the significance of the boat being small. Okay, we're not talking about a huge yacht or cruise liner here. So he says, lustily I dipped my oars into the silent lake. This word lustily, a bit of an unusual context to use this adverb, but it's suggesting that he's really wanting to pursue what he's doing. He's very confident in his actions, and this is further reinforced in the next line, as I rose upon the stroke. And we go further with that, my boat went heaving through the water like a swan. Now, a swan as a creature is a very natural sailor. It is literally a swan's job to sail through the water. So this really gives us an idea of how confident he feels in his ability to navigate through nature, to navigate through this water. He's very, very confident at this point, but it is about to change. So at this point, as we've established, the protagonist William Wordsworth is extremely confident, just in general actually, but particularly his ability to sail through nature effortlessly. However, this is about to change very, very quickly. So we go on, when from behind that craggy steep till then the horizon's bound a huge peak, black and huge. Now, what's interesting here is Wordsworth's use of language. So he talks about a huge peak. Now, for Wordsworth, this is actually quite austere language to use, huge peak. He's not using an elaborate simile or metaphor. We just talk about huge peak. Then it's almost childishly simplistic the way he repeats himself. A huge peak, black and huge. It sounds far away from the Wordsworth that we're familiar with in the rest of the poem. Perhaps that, and a lot of critics have theorized that this is because almost language breaks down here. He's so overwhelmed by nature that he can't think of an elaborate metaphor to use to sum up his feelings. He's almost stuttering and stammering here. A huge peak, black and huge. This mountain that he's seeing in front of him has had a huge impact upon him. And again, I'm using that word huge in the same way he is, because sometimes a complex word isn't always the best to use. The only word that springs to mind is huge. And we go on, as if with voluntary power instinct upreared its head. And this is clear use of personification, uprearing his head, as if nature isn't just this passive concept that we're there. Actually, that nature is something that's active and perhaps is actively trying to hunt humanity down, trying to interfere with humanity. We don't know, but certainly nature has upreared its head, not just this peak, nature itself. So we talked earlier about the use of the swan as an image. He was cutting through the water like a swan. Here is the opposite of swan-like. Swans we associate with grace. This is actually quite violent, quite aggressive. I struck and struck again. So he's almost desperately trying to get away from nature here. And growing still in stature, the grim shape towered up between me and the stars. We can see here, this is a complete reversal in the way he's talking about nature. The grim shape. This is very, very ominous imagery, as if he's really afraid of nature, and he is afraid of nature. This is almost the whole point of this poem, that he starts out confident, he experiences this huge mountain, he becomes overwhelmed, he becomes afraid, and this is why we see this couple of words, grim shape, and it talks about towered up between me and the stars. Again, this language here is used to emphasize just how huge nature is, just how overwhelming it is. This is very far removed from the imagery much earlier on in the poem, which was talking about stars in a more positive way, as if it was just a nice, tranquil little boat ride in the summer. So it seemed, with purpose of its own, a measured motion like a living thing. So again, it reinforces that idea of nature not being a passive thing, but actually something that is actively coming after the narrator. A measured motion like a living thing strode after me with trembling oars. So just in case you thought I was exaggerating the idea of the narrator being afraid, this is really, really reinforced with this idea of trembling oars. This narrator now is seriously frightened about what he's seeing, and this singular verb turn suggests that he's making the quick decision to escape from this overwhelming sight of the nature and the mountain, and he's going to return back and kind of end this adventure that he'd started himself, where he thought it was going to be a nice relaxing boat ride. He now realizes that this is not the case. What he's seen has haunted him, and he wants to make a quick getaway. Then it says, and through the silent water stole my way. Now, silence and nature is often quite a happy marriage. We escape into nature sometimes to actually get away from perhaps a big noisy city or town. But in this case, silent seems to have a more ominous tone, as if there's tension associated with the word, as if we're expecting something to happen, almost to come out from that water and take hold of the narrator. Of course, that doesn't happen, but that's almost the tone that the writer Wordsworth establishes. And he talks about stealing his way back, that he's almost on borrowed territory. He thought, in all his confidence at the start and complacency, he thought he could freely navigate himself through nature, but he now knows that it's not his territory, and that actually he's a human on their territory, and he wants to make his way back. And he escapes back to the covert of the willow tree. This willow tree is almost a kind of safe sanctuary for him to return to. He's away from this scary mountain that initially spooked him. Now we carry on. There in her mooring place I left my bark. So he's leaving that boat behind. And again, we perhaps get that impression that he won't be making a return to that previously familiar setting where he got the boat from. He wants to make a getaway away from nature. And he goes back home. Through the meadows homeward went, in a grave and serious mood. So obviously that word grave has lots of connotations. Obviously, grave meaning extremely serious. This is no longer the light-hearted boat ride that he expected it to be. He's in an extremely serious mood. But obviously, grave, in addition, has clear connotations of death as well. So we see really that nature can be all sorts of things. It can be beautiful, overwhelming. It can also have connotations with death. And he's in a grave and serious mood. But after I had seen that spectacle for many days, my brain worked with a dim and undetermined sense. We might think all of this is a little bit strange. All he's actually done is he's gone on a boat ride, he's encountered a mountain, and now he's frightened to death. Why is this the case? Why is he describing this mountain as a spectacle? We may wonder that it was almost a bit of an epiphany. It's a moment where he suddenly realizes how intense and frightening nature can be. And he talks about his brain working with a dim and undetermined sense of unknown modes of being. What does this mean? Modes of being, is this almost a supernatural reference that he's contemplating? What forces are at work here behind nature? And it really is the idea of active and passive. We might go for a walk through nature and just assume that these trees are passive things, but actually Wordsworth seriously wondering here if that's true at all, and whether there are some dark forces at play. He talks about over my thoughts there hung a darkness. Almost it's triggered a kind of depression in him, perhaps, and certainly he's haunted by what he sees. Call it solitude or blank desertion. Almost desertion, it has connotations of being numb. He's gone through the stage of depression or being overwhelmed, and there's just nothing left. He's numb, and again, solitude. He feels lonely in all of this. No familiar shapes remained, no pleasant images of trees, of sea or sky. This is absolutely crucial. Earlier on in the poem, of course, he was talking about the stars, he was talking about the moon in a very pleasant tone. He was enjoying this little jaunt in nature, but now when he thinks about nature, he doesn't think about trees, beautiful green English countryside. He doesn't think of pleasant sea or sky, no colours of green fields. He now has this more ominous view of nature that is almost permanent. This is a turning plot point in William Wordsworth's life, and we've really got to remember that this is an autobiographical poem. So when he talks about the narrator, or the narrator talks about his experience, we need to be clear that this is William Wordsworth speaking. He talks about, instead of no colour of green fields, the next line is really, really important, but huge and mighty forms. So replaced in his mind, green fields have been replaced with huge and mighty forms, really emphasizing that nature is epic, it's huge, it's overwhelming. And he talks about, as we go on, that do not live like living men, move slowly through the mind by day, and were a trouble to my dreams. So when he is awake, he's almost haunted by this idea of nature. It moves slowly within him in the day. When he goes to sleep, it haunts his dreams. So this experience has been deeply troubling, deeply terrifying. We can go back to much earlier in the poem for a bit of a frame of reference, and we can see he talks about sparkling light here. He talks about glittering idly in the moon, and he talks about drifting through the water like a swan. Um, he rose upon the stroke. He goes from being very confident, almost in love with nature, to being overwhelmed and afraid of nature to the point where it's actually troubling his dreams here right at the end. Okay, so we're just going to conclude this video by looking at the form and the structure of the poem. Now, the idea of form generally refers to the shape and the size of the stanzas in the poem, or indeed if there are any stanzas at all. The term also refers to the type of poem. For example, the poem could be a sonnet or it could be a ballad. Now, in the case of the Prelude, it is an epic poem, or rather it is an extract from an epic poem. Now, an epic poem, key characteristics: firstly, they're extremely long in terms of poetry, and they often focus on a heroic journey or a heroic quest. Now, who is the hero of this poem? Is it William Wordsworth, or is it nature itself? That's something you can reflect upon. In terms of the stanzas, well, there's just one stanza and it's a very continuous stanza. Why is this? Why does Wordsworth decide not to chunk up his ideas into stanzas but rather have a continuous single stanza? There are several reasons you could theorize for this, one being that he is just a single journey. He takes up the boat onto the lake. It starts off, it's a relaxing, tranquil boat ride on a summer evening, and then suddenly it becomes something altogether different. And actually, by keeping it as a continuous stanza, it adds an element of surprise. So when we start off and it's with the references to the stars and the summer evening, we suddenly change when he encounters this huge peak, black and huge. And actually, if Wordsworth were to have used stanzas, that might have signposted that the change was coming. So by keeping it as a continuous stanza, it does enable us to experience some form of surprise, and we experience the narrator's reactions almost with him. The fact that it's a stream of consciousness, one single stanza. So in terms of structure, now remember, structure generally refers to the use of punctuation in the poem and the rhyme scheme. So in terms of a rhyme scheme, there is no rhyme scheme at all. It is written in blank verse. And again, just like we looked at when he encounters that side of the mountain where he describes a huge peak, black and huge, perhaps the lack of a rhyme scheme is the fact that he can't structure his ideas into neat little rhymes. He's been so overwhelmed by nature that he lacks that ability to string together elaborate rhymes, and it could reflect the fact that he has been so overwhelmed by this rather dark experience with nature. Okay, so just to finally conclude this video and say thanks for listening, and I hope you found that useful.